the power of U.S. empire goes, the UAE is going to blow away in the wind.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I am Rory, in charge of podcasting, and in charge of politics is Robert Morris. How are you this time?
I'm doing all right. How you doing, Ray?
You should be in good form. It's after Thanksgiving. You've had lots of festivities.
Well, yeah, I'm speaking for myself in the future. I'm probably overweight and underslept, but
and loving life. I have a confession to make.
Oh, well, let's hear it.
I was on another podcast. Can you please forgive me?
Good God.
Yes.
Good God, Ray. You've abandoned me. Where were you?
I went very far away to another Northern Irish podcast. The WTFDYW podcast, What the Feck Do You Want podcast. And I was asked, what the feck do I want? And I said, I would like to talk about Wake and Fright. So
It's a video game.
No, it is a, new wave Australian film that was lost and then found in 2010.
Oh,
so
wow.
One of the few films to be re-released. I think it's been re-released at Cannes, which is very rare because technically it was a second release because they found the original footage because it was a bit of a flop. And infamous for a very harrowing kangaroo execution scene.
Wow, like the kangaroo executes people, or?
No, they shit kangaroos.
Oh, that sounds terrible.
And it's
Ray.
actual just, footage of kangaroos getting shot. And do you know where the meat
I think that's
the
illegal
kangaroos?
in the United States.
Yes, but do you know where the meat goes? Mostly American pet food.
Interesting.
Yes.
I did not know that.
No.
Kangaroos are so cute, Rory.
Yes, but the Australians do like to ping them.
So our dogs are eating kangaroo. I had no idea.
Well, some dogs are, but not all dogs.
Good gosh. You learn something new every day. I'm sorry, but you went on this podcast and talked about shooting kangaroos for at great length?
No, well, it wasn't specifically that. It was about this film, which is about, it's set in early 70s and about an English teacher who's from England. Are you aware of the £10 palms?
I am not.
Australia wanted more immigrants, particularly white immigrants from Britain. So it offered a thing where for £10, which is roughly, I'm trying to think, would it be about £120 sterling, roughly that in American dollars, you could go to Australia. But the twist was they wouldn't pay for your way back. I think you could get education and jobs.
Jeez.
And I think in about today's money, it's maybe about like $7,000 to break out of it. So technically you were an indentured servant.
Wow, in the 20th century.
So they'd give you the jobs the Australians didn't want. So he's teaching in the proper outback. And then he decides to go to the nearby mining town. But it's just a lot of the extras are basically just local townspeople. And it's a lovely sort of moment in time. So yeah, I just talked about that film.
We'll have to put a link to the podcast.
Yes.
In the
when it gets uploaded.
Indeed.
If you had a podcast, Rob, what would you like to talk about on it?
We'd be talking about actually another implementation or manifestation of British Empire, which is the United Arab Emirates.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we talk about this country a lot in a sort of glancing way. You can't talk about the war in Yemen over the past decade without talking about the United Arab Emirates. You can't talk about really, I feel like most of the conflicts we cover at great length on this podcast without talking about the United Arab Emirates. They've got their finger in everything, whether you're talking about the crushing of the Arab Spring, conflicts in Sudan, conflicts in Libya, conflicts in Ethiopia. They are pretty much the third or fourth most important country in all of these conflicts, if not the second most important. And I feel like we've never really given them their due. We haven't actually done a discussion of the United Arab Emirates, which I think is a great oversight because, yeah, they really are tremendously important in the running of North Africa, in the running of the Middle East, in the running, quite frankly, of Washington, D.C. This is one of the...
So they definitely punch above their weight.
Yes, no question.
I've heard them also described as Little Sparta. Have you heard that before for them?
I have heard that. I put that in the video. Trump's defense secretary, Jim Mattis, was famous for calling them Little Sparta. I think specifically, I think that estimation is more than a little bit of an overestimate. I think
Mhm.
that an overrating, a pretty severe overrating.
Okay.
They are much more competent than our incredibly incompetent and weak allies in the region more generally. That is saying very little, and I think that it does not. That doesn't merit. Perhaps I rate the Spartans too highly. I don't know. I feel like that was meant by Jim Mattis as a very high compliment, and I don't think the UAE deserves it, frankly.
Okay. Because I've heard some historians saying they don't really like Sparta because there's not much about them and they're quite simple. Also, everything we know about them isn't from their perspective, so
Who knows?
who knows? But we do know a lot about United Arab Emirates from their own perspective.
Well, what's interesting is and I guess this isn't a particularly new dynamic, but it's shocking whenever I see it. The way that there was just nothing going on in the deserts of Arabia before oil. It is
It's
quite
well,
stunning.
I think United Arab Emirates has like less than 1% arable land. Like shockingly little that you could have done with this place without oil.
So the Emirates, I believe, primarily have their origins as sort of sea-based countries. They are little ports, and the emirs of those ports, and some of them had larger trading networks, and some of them were just in charge of a bunch of pearl fishers, is my understanding. And I've tried to dive in on sort of the early history of the United Arab Emirates, and specifically their sort of creation as the Trucial Kingdoms, is what they were called when they were part of the British Empire. And there's just not a lot there, Rory. I'm sure I could dive into an archive somewhere, and I need to read a book on the
Hmm.
UAE, but specifically this sort of earlier period, it feels weirdly like Central Asia, sort of Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, these countries that in prior millennia or prior centuries, maybe 5 centuries back, were tremendously significant, like a really, really big deal. And then there just the trade route shifted and there just wasn't anything going on there for a long time. So you can hear there is absolutely were titanic clashes between the Ottomans and the Portuguese over the current territory of the United Arab Emirates, going up and down. Basra was a really important Basra in modern Iraq was a really important entrepot and important for a variety of trade routes, so it made sense for the Ottomans and the Portuguese to battle over the Straits of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf more generally. And then you just sort of don't hear much. And it just wasn't that important. It was important enough to the British because what was very important after the formation of the Suez Canal was the Red Sea, the transit through the Suez Canal. But just sort of the Persian Gulf was kind of a backwater, and the British were there, it seems to me, largely to rein in any potential piracy. Like, they just didn't
Mm.
want the Strait of Hormuz to be a center of piracy, so they made a bunch of truces or treaty arrangements with the Trucial Kingdoms, I think in the early 1800s, becoming more formalized in the mid-1800s, and then formalized again a little more in the late 1800s. But it's really just kind of an afterthought. There wasn't a lot that was going on there that was important. One dynamic I read about this morning is apparently it was the UAE was a tremendous source of pearls, apparently, and then the Japanese developed a more efficient industrial way to make pearls, and
Hmm.
then all of a sudden they mattered even less. So just not a lot going on in the UAE, and really the Trucial Kingdoms. It's I don't want to be it seemed to be dismissing the UAE, but like there just wasn't anybody there. And these emirs, you also saw this dynamic in southern Yemen and in other places throughout the British Empire. They're just like, okay, this is the local headman. We'll give him a very flattering treaty. He'll either do pretty much what we ask and not get in our way, or we'll come in and kill him and replace him with a son. I mean, it is not a particularly interesting historical area until the 1930s through the 1960s or so, when we get the discovery and the development of large oil and gas resources. And I think the important part of this story is just how incredibly weak the UAE is and how incredibly dependent the
Hmm.
UAE is on US empire. Like even more than Taiwan, even more than Israel, certainly even more than Ukraine. The power of U.S. empire goes, the UAE is going to blow away in the wind. It's an interesting set of countries in the Persian Gulf. UAE is 10 million people. Of that, only 1 million are citizens.
Is this basically a lot of, wealthy people from around the world in places like Dubai, and then you have a lot of people from Southeast Asia doing a lot of being indentured servants, as we've mentioned before, and working in very horrendous conditions because they're not naturalized. You can stay there for 30 years. You have to go back home to India. Is that what you mean?
Exactly. It is. Yeah, I mean, that is
So it
just
is
what the
only a
population of the
1
UAE.
million um United Arab Emirates. What would you call them? Emiratis?
Yeah, Emiratis,
Okay,
yes.
so there's only 1 million.
There's only 1 million Emirati citizens.
That's outstanding because that's less than Northern Ireland, which I always considered to be like a nothing.
Yeah, no, it is a tiny polity, but of course, I mean, of those 10 million people, there are people who are living their whole lives there, working there, just not with the benefit of citizenship. Some are there because they have no other choice. Some are there because, on the wealthier end, some people are there because the UAE likes to facilitate a lot of, shall we say, creative business practices.
Hmm.
That I knew businesses that were entirely based in Istanbul that told everybody they were based in the UAE. And like
Do they
we
kind of
had sort of
remind you a bit of a Switzerland if Switzerland was a lot less neutral?
yeah, I think that's a good comparison. It is
Because it
just
seems to
this.
attract a lot of money, a lot of wealthy people, and highly militarized, and seem to work as brokers for a lot of peace treaties and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely, one of the roles that the UAE has attempted, to take on, for itself.
Hmm.
Interesting detail from sort of the founding of the UAE in the 1970s, by the way. One of my great bugaboos is that, everybody just sort of assumes that, European empire ended in 1945 and that was it, and, no, that's actually really, as I'm learning and will be publishing in a book called American Empire: The First 100 Years that'll be coming out hopefully at some point in 2025. The story of the Cold War really is mostly a story of decolonization. Like, that's what was going on in Vietnam, that's what was going on in Algeria, I mean, that's what the Cold War is about fundamentally, until the oil crisis, is decolonization. And, in 1968 or thereabouts, the British decided they could no longer support one of what was then one of the last, big shreds of their empire, which was the Trucial Kingdoms, which then became the UAE.
Hmm.
In the 1970s, the expectation was that Bahrain and Qatar, all of these countries, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, Oman, all of these countries were Saudi Arabia, were, more or less, British dependents. Saudi Arabia was sort of big enough, and by the end of World War II was sort of more in the US column, the British column, probably. The Trucial Kingdoms were sort of one of the last vestiges of British Empire that really didn't get sort of started as the UAE until the 1970s. Bahrain and Qatar were both big enough, and I think Bahrain may have already had the US base at this point, but I'm not entirely certain. Were confident enough to go it alone. 7 of these emirates decided to band together. I think initially 6 of them, and then the 7th added on a year or 2 later. It's a really interesting map, the map of the Emirates. I think it's probably fair to say that what matters out of these 7 Emirates are Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and to a much smaller extent, Sharjah, and then the others are tiny. But really, it's Abu Dhabi that calls the shots. Abu Dhabi and Dubai have similar populations. Dubai has really distinguished itself as sort of what we were talking about earlier, that big home of dodgy, specifically a lot of dodgy British business people, but Europeans and Americans and
The likes of Andrew Tate.
yes, yes, everybody really, but a lot of dodgy Western business people. And I think there is a bit of a tussle, or at least a little bit of friction between Dubai and Abu Dhabi, with the
Hmm.
understanding that Abu Dhabi is pretty much on top, especially after the 2008 financial crisis, where Dubai had a collapse of their own. I don't recall exactly what the details of it
Because I
were. I don't know
think
if they
would you
did.
describe their citizens as some of the most fair weather? Like the hint at anything going wrong and they're out of there.
That was this famous, I remember in the aftermath of, I don't know if it was the 2008 or 2009 crisis in Dubai, they're talking about how the airports were just clogged, absolutely full. The airport parking lots were filled with abandoned luxury vehicles because all of these
Is it
expats.
illegal to be bankrupt? Is that what I've heard? Or bankruptcy laws are incredibly harsh and cruel. So it's like when things go wrong, you just bail.
Yeah, I can't speak to the details of that, but I do know that there were a whole bunch of expats just abandoned the country and their luxury cars because it would have been bad
I
for
think
them
they've
if they
had to
had been in
like
the UAE.
basically churn them if they're not, because for a long time they were just kept for years, but now it's like if it's not claimed after so long, it gets reconditioned and sold on. But yeah, it
And they're
just seems
probably
to be
pretty nice cars, you know?
oh yeah, some very ordinary cars and some brilliant cars, but yeah, it does seem to be like if you want like the most excesses of the modern world, you go to Dubai just to see waste upon waste.
I think I've got this right. The head of Abu Dhabi is always the president, and the head of Dubai is always the prime minister. And I think I do recall there being some tensions between Dubai and Abu Dhabi, but I think those tensions were largely resolved by the financial crisis, which hit Dubai much, much harder. So the populations between Dubai and Abu Dhabi seem comparable. The oil and gas reserves are not. Abu Dhabi has 92 billion barrels of oil in reserve, and Dubai has four. And this is actually why Dubai
Well,
and
because Abu Dhabi is most of the country. It does include a lot of desert, but that desert has oil. It also includes a lot of the sea territory, which also has a lot of
Mhm.
oil and gas. So
Yep.
it's just much bigger, more likely to have more things on it.
Exactly. And Dubai, like, is a sizable chunk of the country, but much smaller than Abu Dhabi's, and the other four Emirates are just sort of on that
They're
tip,
yeah,
clustered in that
tiny.
tip there. And I think Sharjah has, I think, there's like 3.5 million in Abu Dhabi and Dubai each, and then maybe 1.5 in Sharjah, and then it's quite tiny.
So just to give an idea of how much they have in total, it's what 6% of global reserves.
Wow. Okay. That's Abu Dhabi or the UAE in general?
The United Arab Emirates as a total,
In total.
and something similar to world. I think it's 7% of world gas as well.
That's a key thing. UAE is a huge, huge exporter of
I
LNG.
think they also invented the way of basically putting it in tankers. When you see those tankers that have like four giant balls on them, I think that was a technology founded by the United Arab Emirates.
I'm gonna go with. Well, no, I don't dispute that that may have started, but I'm probably gonna be more likely to credit the Japanese for
Hmm.
that innovation because I think it was UAE cargoes going from the UAE to Japan. Yeah, I
Ah,
don't.
that makes more sense though.
That it does a bit, right? I mean, who knows? Perhaps I'm being dramatically unfair. Perhaps there is some Emirati genius who came up with all that. But I feel like I might have read something once about the Japanese guy who did that. But I don't dispute that those first cargoes were coming from the UAE. And of course, that is a bit of a tension between the United States and the UAE, as the United States is becoming a LNG, liquefied natural gas exporting giant. This is
Hmm.
not so great for the UAE or Qatar, which is big in LNG as well. Of course, the UAE cares a lot less about these issues. It cares about these issues than, say, Saudi Arabia does, because the UAE has such a small population. And I think those million Emiratis, I'm sure there's divisions and socioeconomic winners and losers, but I think the stereotype, which I don't think is entirely incorrect, is that most Emiratis are able to live a life of some luxury and some, pretty high level handouts. That as oil and gas revenues fall, Saudi Arabia has had to be cutting over the past decade and will have to cut more deeply, whereas the UAE can probably just sort of continue to survive even at vastly lower oil and gas prices. So I don't think this is going to be an unstable country.
Something the UAE has done which Saudi Arabia hasn't, I can tell, is Saudi Arabia seems like it's diversified a lot better. It seems like it's working on lots of different things, tourism being the main one, but working with money and other technologies and stuff. So they have like they seem to be very aware that oil will run out, while Saudi Arabia feels like it still doesn't believe it will run out.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
I could see it being a much more gentle transition, while Saudi Arabia will just collapse.
no question. I think that's a real. I think that's a real a very solid way of looking at it. What I do think is interesting is just how quickly so the British withdrew in the late 60s, early 1970s. And by the 1980s, as a new thing, the United States started garrisoning the Persian Gulf. I think it is worthwhile to emphasize that like in 1970s the British leave, 1980s the United States arrives. The United States arrived in the context of the Iraq-Iran War and preserving freedom of navigation for oil and gas. That's, I think, the point at which I think there were a lot of operations out of Bahrain by that point. This is key and makes it frustrating that the United Arab Emirates has acted against U.S. interests so frequently over the past decade. The UAE only exists because of the United States, and I think that's really worth.
Well, in its current
Yes,
state.
the Trucial Kingdoms only existed in their state because of the British Empire, and then the Trucial Kingdoms became the UAE, and they own. And it's interesting.
So Britain gave birth to it, and then America raised it.
Exactly. And like in a very, and I point to that kind of progression with Saudi Arabia, but like Saudi Arabia is a country of 30 million people, however useless their military is. Like, were somebody to come in and attempt to take Saudi Arabia, they would have a very hard time. It's a real country. Is established in the 1970s. The Shah of Iran just sort of, hopped in and, as the British left, hopped in and took a bunch of islands that
Mhm.
the Trucial Kingdoms thought belonged to them, and killed some policemen and completely wiped out. No, not wiped out. Well, I mean, yes, wiped out. Ethnically cleansed would be a fair description, but essentially, the numbers are so low that I don't think people think about it that way so much. But basically, took everybody who lived on these islands, put them on a boat, and dumped them back in, the landward UAE. So Iran, in the 1970s, Iran took territory from the UAE, Saudi Arabia took territory from the UAE, and of course, Kuwait, I think, was large enough that it was never considered. And just, I think Kuwait's more at the top of the Persian Gulf rather than sort of in the middle of it, the way the rest of these Emirates and Qatar and Bahrain are. It is very clear and illuminated over and over again at multiple points in the 1980s and the 1990s that all of these little countries are entirely dependent on there being a world hegemon that refuses to allow the much larger countries that they border on, Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, from just simply swallowing them up and taking their resources, which they would very much like to benefit from.
If you add their oil reserves up with Saudi Arabia, it like dwarfs everything else. Like it surpasses Venezuela's terrible low quality oil. You just have like a giant super state with what could be over 20%, 25% of the world's oil. It would just be outstanding. So it is just divide and conquer, really, isn't it?
Well, that's an interesting dynamic I'd never really thought about. But, as Saudi Arabia goes through what I anticipate to be fairly soon death throes, it will be very tempting for them to just sort of reach over and take Abu Dhabi. Because that's another couple years of keeping Saudi Arabia's 40 million people in scholarships to European universities and whatnot.
Because
And
Kuwait's
so
what, 6%, and then United Arab Emirates is also 6% of world. So add them up
amazing, amazing.
on top of your
Uh,
already 17, which Saudi Arabia has.
that's kind of extraordinary. And I think we've emphasized a lot, like just how damaging, it's just worth mentioning as we're talking about the Persian Gulf, just how damaging a US-Iran war would be,
Oh yeah,
because
yeah.
all of this gets knocked out. It's really the only thing that can seriously impact oil prices in a positive sense.
Would be great for electric cars.
Be great for electric cars. It would be amazing for U.S. petroleum producers, but not many other people.
No, it would cause a lot of suffering.
It'd be pretty good for Russia, that's for sure.
Yeah.
They do a lot of LNG. Or no, actually, do they do a lot of it? No, they just do a lot of natural gas through pipelines to Europe, but Europe would certainly, it's U.S. production that is allowing Europe to curtail its use of Russia. But I don't know how much of that is going directly to, how much Persian Gulf LNG is going directly to Europe. I assume a lot, but even if it isn't, just that is evening out the market worldwide. So yeah, Russia would also benefit from a U.S.-Iran war majorly. So I want to emphasize that again. Just Iran was taking territory from the UAE in the 70s. Saudi Arabia was trying to take territory. It being Saudi Arabia, they weren't as successful at it. And then in the 1980s, the United States basically moved into the Persian Gulf to help Saddam Hussein beat Iran, or at least not lose too much to Iran in the Iran-Iraq War, which is amusing for those of us who know that then destroying Saddam Hussein became the U.S.'s main goal once they moved in there. But yeah, so there have been maybe 15 really uncomfortable years for the UAE not having the protection of the United States or the United Kingdom. And during those periods of time, they were losing territory. That is just an indication of how extraordinarily dependent the UAE is on the United States. So they have,
Mm.
I suppose wisely, and as much as I would like to complain about it, I get it, they have spent a tremendous amount bribing people in Washington, D.C. This is a really gross dynamic of the way that U.S. foreign policy is done in the United States. I don't think Saudi Arabia and the UAE have much influence on domestic U.S. policy. They'll actually, I mean, honestly, they probably do have a say now in tech regulation, financial
I always
regulation.
get the feeling there always seems to be like there's like one or two states some random country seems to have massive influence of in America, I always find.
Yeah, and well, it's pretty straightforward. It's just because we've talked about the UAE's oil resources. We've talked about the fact that even compared to Saudi Arabia, they don't have that much they have to spend this money on. So that money is funneled into making Abu Dhabi and Dubai, of course, extraordinarily luxurious places. I think there's the number of cultural institutions in Europe and the United States that have branches in Abu Dhabi just to make money out. Like New York University famously has one. I think the Guggenheim's got one, just to basically harvest that money. And I'm sure there are extraordinary museums to visit. Not that I would ever
Yes.
go to the UAE.
A slave state?
Well, I mean, I don't know. Like, considering my rather clear opinions, despite how little reach they have, I just feel like it'd probably be a dumb place to go, personally, as I would expect this podcast to not help with. Saudi
True.
Arabia and the UAE get compared a lot because they are similar in some senses. They are folks with ambitions, with regional ambitions. They are monarchs that are really against the idea of Arab democracy. And the UAE, more so than Saudi Arabia, has worked really, really hard in the aftermath of 2011's Arab Spring, these democratic uprisings across the Arab world. The UAE has been even more pivotal in crushing all of these democratic uprisings than even Saudi Arabia was. Specifically in Yemen, where Saudi Arabia really, really, really wanted to defeat the Houthis, as I mentioned in this absurdly long How Yemen Beat Saudi Arabia video I did recently. Saudi Arabia was willing to work with anybody to fight the Houthis, including the Islah Party, which was a Muslim Brotherhood affiliated party on the ground that was probably the most serious political actor outside of Ali Abdullah Saleh or the Houthis themselves. And the UAE basically paid a bunch of U.S. mercenaries to assassinate those guys.
They really don't like the Muslim Brotherhood.
They really don't. And the reason they don't like them is because the Muslim Brotherhood is about the idea, among a number of other things, that Arabs should be allowed to govern themselves democratically. And that is not something
No.
that an emir likes. But we're getting a little bit ahead of the game here. So as you pointed out, just this absurd influence that the UAE has. And it really has a lot more discretionary money than Saudi Arabia does.
Mhm.
And Saudi Arabia, when it had a lot of discretionary money, was more interested in pushing Wahhabism. This is a pre-Arab Spring. This is a pre-MBS thing. Pushing the kinds of radical Islam that got 9/11 done. Whereas the UAE seems to have mostly been out for itself and
But
with a
is it
very
also not
idiosyncratic.
somewhat secular? They seem happy enough to have people of all religions to come there.
Oh, no, I think that would be an overstatement. Whereas I think
Okay.
the leadership,
Compared to Saudi Arabia,
compared to Saudi Arabia,
but it is a low bar.
though Saudi Arabia is working really hard to catch up in that
Oh yeah, but I
regard.
feel like they are copying the Emirates at this point.
Yes.
They feel like
Yes.
they've done everything better, And also, didn't they take the whole being associated with 9/11 thing? Because one of the hijackers was from the UAE, am I right?
Mhm.
And they seemed to take that very serious, while Saudi Arabia was not as much as it should have.
I mean, that's I well, Rudy Giuliani will tell you that when Al Qaeda decided to attack Saudi Arabia in 2004, 2005, then
Mm-hmm.
Saudi Arabia started taking it super serious. But I'm not sure I really agree with that. The UAE, because it is smaller, and because the UAE, unlike Saudi Arabia, actually has legitimate business interests. I think you're right to say that, like, they do take Washington, D.C.'s displeasure a lot more seriously. A controversy that I barely personally remember and was reading about the outlines of this morning was, I think, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, or maybe it was a year or so before. Dubai Ports World was a Dubai business that operates ports throughout the world, conveniently enough, became the target of the U.S. government because of that connection to 9/11, because it seemed a little weird to have representatives of a Arab, religiously conservative Muslim company running U.S. ports. And I think that certainly in the direct aftermath of 9/11, the UAE, which is, as we have mentioned, known for creative business practices, including stuff that could be construed as money laundering, was very quick to give U.S. investigative agencies everything they asked for. So I think, yeah, I think it is true to say that they are a little in the context of the war in Yemen, when the U.S. Congress turned pretty volubly against that war. The UAE pulled all of its troops out in 2019. And Saudi Arabia didn't really give up on that war until 3 years later. So yeah, I think UAE is a little more nimble. The UAE has its finger on the pulse of what's going on in Washington, D.C. It is using its money, its connections to attempt to steer what goes on in Washington, D.C. But when it feels that the wind is blowing in a certain direction, it gets out of the way of the wind. And I think that's another argument for UAE's likely sustainability. I think it's actually worth mentioning a single figure. Obviously, MBZ, the crown prince, I guess he's probably no longer the crown prince. He may just be the leader of Abu Dhabi, seen as like a sort of a what's the word? Not a father figure, but like as a mentor to MBS, and they sort of were very close in launching the war on Yemen, and are perhaps less close as I think MBS is seeing how MBZ and the UAE use that war to their benefit, while also sabotaging Saudi Arabia's war against the Houthis. MBZ is very important and worth being aware of, but perhaps more so is Youssef Al Otaiba, who is the UAE ambassador to the United States. He is, well, no longer, but he's still, relatively young man. I suppose he's just turning 50. But he has been the UAE ambassador to the United States since 2008. So for like 16 years now. So going back to my time in Washington, D.C., he has been renowned as just sort of a Washington, D.C. sort of social kingmaker or what have you. I mean, this is, that there's like any capital city, there's an embassy party circuit, and then there's a cooler circuit of parties and social stuff where real power is talked about.
But it's sort of
And
crazy to think that he has a lot more experience than the American politicians there. Like, because he's been there that long.
yeah, yeah. The only comparable figure I can think of is a Saudi ambassador who was there for a very long time. Bandar bin Sultan, I think was his name. He was there through 9/11. And I think he's long, long gone. And the Saudi ambassadors to the U.S. are less significant figures, or certainly figures who've been there less long. But I mean, Yusuf al-Otaiba, you can definitely find long profiles of Otaiba, some that are hostile, some that are adoring, just talking about how significant this guy is in Washington, D.C. And if you have a figure like that who's been in Washington, D.C., throwing all the right parties, knowing all the right people for 16 years, that ambassador is going to have an outsized influence on policy related to his country, but also because of the UAE's unique positioning for the region more generally. And I think we've done enough groundwork that to just say that the UAE's influence throughout the Middle East, North Africa, the Horn of Africa is immense. And it is largely pretty bad. I think
But they
I
did
do
get an
I
island from Yemen, so that's something.
yeah, there's that. There is that. And I think that they got a lot more than an island from Yemen,
Mm.
Rory. I mean, they've got control of most of Yemen's ports, including Aden, a place that once upon a time, I think in the 1960s, was the second largest port on the world.
But did that not kind of backfire on them?
You see, that's the funny thing. It absolutely did backfire on them. The Saudis protested, the Yemeni government protested. They had control of Socotra, and they had to back off from control of Socotra, and then they had to back off from control of the port in Al Marra in Yemen, and there was a big to do about it. But that was all about 4 years ago, Marie. And now, if you look into the details, now who's running the tours in Socotra? Who's running? It's all the UAE. So
Wow.
they had a big to do, and they're like, oh, I'm so sorry, MBS, that you're right. We're taking too much, and oh, I'm so sorry, Yemen's official government. But I mean, that was 4 or 5 years ago, Ray, and I remember those storylines too. And
Hmm.
the Yemeni government that they supposedly deferred to doesn't exist anymore. Saudi Arabia was just like, we're going to do a new one. And yeah, I think if you look at the practicalities of how Socotra is being run, how I can't remember the name of the Al Marra port is run, Mukalla and Hadramaut, Aden, it's all the UAE. Yeah, it's not. That's not the way things should go. Yemen is a sovereign country, or at least it was.
Yeah.
This list that we're about to go through, it's just kind of extraordinary how, for a country that is so dependent on the United States, so dependent, it is doing very little to add to the sustainability of U.S. empire. I don't doubt that MBZ and Ambassador Otaiba probably on some level believe that they're being helpful to the United States, but it's mostly being helpful to the UAE in incredibly destructive ways that are not helpful to the sustainability of U.S. empire, nor are they helpful to the sustainability of the United Arab Emirates. The UAE has the resources it needs to survive in the 21st century's petroleum environment, unlike Saudi Arabia, but it is in much greater risk of simply being swallowed up by its neighbors than Saudi Arabia ever will be.
Because didn't it ask for a lot of like F-35s and stuff, and America has sort of given it the green light, but they physically haven't happened yet? It seems like a lot of the defense America's promise is taking a lot longer than it should.
Well, our military-industrial complex is famously a big mess. I'm vaguely recalling something related to that F-35s, but not those contracts, but not fully recalling, I'm afraid. I mean, the UAE has bought and built and now operates nuclear reactors. It is
Wow.
that was a big. I think Otaiba had something to do with that. They are a very favored partner of the United States, given these incredible compliments of sort of this little Sparta. They are broadly an agent of chaos, and they fund agents of chaos.
Yeah.
And that's not good for the UAE long term, and that's not good for the United States long term. It is, I mean, let's just run through the list. In Syria, actually, they weren't so bad. They actually, unlike Saudi Arabia and Turkey, seemed to be capable of sort of turning, and the United States, seemed to be capable of sort of turning the ship around. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, certainly, and the United States kept funding Islamist radicals in Syria years after the emergence of the Islamic State. The UAE was on board with everybody else in 2011, 2012, funding a hodgepodge of nasty jihadist militias that eventually gave way, became, or just lost to the Islamic State in the Assad-free areas we'd spent billions upon billions to build up. But by 2015, which is strikingly early, the UAE was like, hey, wait a second, maybe this isn't so great. And I'm sure they continued to fund everybody and play both sides against each other. But the UAE has actually been out ahead of other countries in saying, you know what, it's time to talk to Assad. It's time to bring him in from the cold. This, of course, has very limited actual economic implementation because Syria is still subject to massive sanctions. But, and they're subject to U.S. sanctions. There's really nothing, the UAE can't fund putting one rock back on top of another, if that's the case. But in Syria, actually, I think the UAE is probably doing the right thing. In Libya, oh my God, I haven't talked about Libya for years on this channel, but long-term heads will remember the figure of Khalifa Haftar, who's now in his mid-80s or something along those lines, and has still acted as he has, not since the very beginning in 2011, 2012, but since his arrival back in the country in 2014. Khalifa Haftar has acted as the main spoiler keeping Libya from reunifying. Don't let me perhaps that overstates the power of Khalifa Haftar. There are plenty of Libyans standing in the way of, a reunified, Libya and peace in that country since, the United States chose to destroy it back in 2011. Haftar's pretty much like the main figure, and outrageously in 2019, Donald Trump gave him sort of a wink and a nod, and the UAE and Saudi Arabia heavily funded Haftar to attempt to conquer the country, bringing the war back to a fever pitch, and it was, of course, a failed attempt to fully conquer the country. So yeah, that's Haftar. I mean, what the UAE does in country after country is they identify somebody to back and back heavily. And they're not necessarily wrong. I think Haftar is a bad choice. I think Abiy Ahmed, their client in Ethiopia, is, clearly a really powerful actor, maybe also a genocidaire, as we have discussed on this podcast. But they just pick this figure and they fund them to the hilt. And I'm sure they're also funding other actors. But it's just been really bad for Libya. In Sudan, it has been apocalyptically bad. It's been a while since we've talked about Sudan. There's just so little has changed. It's just the same nasty situation, two parts of the military fighting against each other. The main reason, I'd say probably the main reason underlying why this newer part of the military is able to go toe-to-toe with the traditional Sudanese armed forces is their gold mines, where they sell the gold to the UAE. In
Wow.
addition to the UAE directly having a direct funding and military resources providing relationship with the Rapid Support Forces and, God, what is this? It's something Dagalo. Hemeti, I think, is his nickname. Is it Mohammed Dagalo? I'm not entirely certain. But the head of the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, is a UAE client. The forces around him, I don't know what he was doing personally, made a lot of money supporting the UAE and Saudi forces in the war in Yemen between 2015 and 2019. Like, there's this sea of bad news.
What is the thread that you'd say connects all of the organizations that the UAE supports?
The UAE is a small country. The UAE wants to control ports in sort of like a Venice-style sort of maritime empire.
Mm-hmm.
They are a small country, and I think they like having heavily armed military actors on their payroll. I think that's Haftar is far enough away that it's hard to imagine how he would exert force in the UAE's favor. But then, of course, in Tripoli, the not very democratic, but occasionally aspiring to be democratic, folks in Tripoli have, an affiliation with the Muslim Brotherhood. So they hate that. Dagalo has actually, or at least the Rapid Support Forces that are under him, have, I think, answer your question directly. They have provided cannon fodder for UAE agendas in Yemen. I think that is the key thing that the RSF have been willing to provide, and that's why the UAE has funded him so liberally. Egypt, and this is like sort of an older dynamic. We don't talk about it so much because it's been fully accomplished. Egypt is part of the joint UAE-Saudi crusade against any democratically elected Arab politician. I believe it was 2012 when Mohammed Morsi was elected, and by 2013, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, with U.S. acquiescence, if not collusion, launched a bloody coup under Sisi. And this has been bankrolled by the United Arab Emirates every step of the way. Sisi has survived as the dictator of Egypt for 11 years now, with monstrously large UAE funding. I think we've talked about, I guess it was still just this year, where I can't remember I think, yeah, $35 billion bailout
Wow.
for
That's
Egypt. This is
incredible.
an extraordinary, such a large amount that it amounts to a significant portion of UAE's annual GDP. I think something along the lines of 6% of GDP was dedicated to buying up a bunch of Egyptian real estate. So this is an ongoing thing. Egypt's nasty dictatorship was set up by the UAE, and they continue to fund it to the point where it's actually like a ruinous amount of money, even by UAE standards.
Okay.
I think, and that's sort of an indication. Like, it would be one thing if all of the shady manipulative things that the UAE was doing were leading to regional stability. Perhaps there'd be moral objections, but it's not. It's leading to like a teetering house of cards that is probably on the way to falling over. So that is Libya, that is Sudan, that is Egypt. Ethiopia, we've talked a lot on this podcast about Abiy Ahmed, the sort of messianic
Hmm.
figure who's been the prime minister of Ethiopia since 2018, and the fairly horrific wars that he has either initiated or played an enthusiastic part in. He is heavily, heavily funded by the UAE to the point where, as we've documented in a couple different forms on this channel, probably best is like maybe 2-3 years back, there's like a 27-minute explanation of the Ethiopian Civil War on the YouTube channel. And essentially, the success, then what looked like the near failure, and then the renewed success of Abiy Ahmed in his war against Tigray was all about UAE funding for drones. The Tigrayans thought they could do well against Abiy Ahmed's inexperienced
Hmm.
military. Turns out they couldn't because of all the UAE-funded drones. When it looked like Abiy Ahmed was about to commit a truly horrific genocide of 6 or 7 million people, the U.S. told the UAE to back off because, we only let Israelis do that sort of thing. All of a sudden, people were talking about Abiy Ahmed's capital of a country of 110 million being conquered by these 6 million Tigrayans. And then the U.S. told the UAE they could fund him again. Like, it is incredible just how in this country of 110, maybe 120, maybe 130 million people, the UAE has been the deciding factor in how those conflicts go.
Has a million proper citizens and the rest are immigrants.
Yes, exactly. And to be clear, their sort of funding and there are two conflicts that are often brought up as why you care about Israel, Gaza, look at what's happening in Sudan, look at what's happening in Ethiopia. The UAE is at the center of both of those things, and also most worthwhile signatory of the Abraham Accords with Israel, which
Wow.
is a fun way to tie all that together. Yemen, I feel like I could just point everybody to the hour-long magnum opus I had put up on the YouTube video to talk about the UAE's screwing over of the Yemenis, screwing over of the Saudis, screwing over really everybody in the name of picking up some Yemeni ports. I think that's about it. I think that's my tour de horizon of the UAE's absurdly outsized influence. So I think we started off talking about Jim Mattis's calling them the little Sparta. There's no question that they are infinitely more influential and have infinitely more levers of power and, yes, even military force to pull than, say, the Saudis do. But that doesn't imply that they're doing a real good job.
So they seem like they've sort of maybe helped one place, and the vast majority of the time they just make things worse.
Yeah, and it does have a real look of sort of a house of cards that's about to fall over. I think it's really significant. I keep harping on this. Sometimes feel like it's the only thing I know about the region from the past year. But the fact that they saw fit to dedicate 6% of their GDP to shoring up, successfully for now, to shoring up the Egyptian dictator, Sisi, is, I think, really, really significant and a sign of deep
I've
desperation.
got some reports that saying it's like 100 billion since 2013 they've given to Egypt.
Is that Saudi and UAE handouts to Egypt, or is that just the UAE?
I think that's just UAE from what I can see here.
That's an extraordinary amount of money. So that's like, well, I guess over 10 years, I guess extraordinary amounts of money can look less
Yeah.
extraordinary, but yeah, that's absurd.
And for what? It doesn't really do. Can you see Egypt being helped by this?
Well, Sisi is willing to acquiesce, less and less, but is willing to acquiesce in whatever Israel wants to do to the Palestinians. And I think, sadly, that is the extent of the U.S.'s vision for the region. We are content to allow the UAE to screw up anything it wants to, as long as it's keeping Egypt stable enough to facilitate a
And
genocide.
is there talk that the UAE is going to buy a city in Egypt or something like that?
Oh, they more than that. So
Oh.
the $35 billion deal is, I think, like 100 miles of coastline or something like that.
They do love a coastline.
True enough. So they have bought up a wide, a wide swath of Egyptian coastline. There's no way, like Qatar's investment in Jared Kushner, there's no way that real estate is worth as much as they paid for it. But I guess
True.
anything is worth whatever someone will pay for it. It's a bailout. It's not a savvy real estate transaction.
So, yes, Sparta, if it decided to just wreck everyone nearby for no apparent reason, it would seem.
Well, I mean, there's some descriptions of Sparta that would be in tune with that. They were famous. I mean, the Spartans also famous slave drivers.
Also didn't like the Persians.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
But then when the price was right, they then worked with them.
Yep. Well, the UAE is also, I think, one of the best things about the UAE actually is that they tend to play both sides with, as they have
work
to.
as what's the term I'm looking for? They tend to be where
mediators? Is it mediators?
Yes, mediators.
Yes.
Quite often that's where they agree to do the deals is in the UAE.
Yeah. I mean, I think probably Oman and Qatar, the UAE all have like that vibe. Maybe UAE a little less so than Oman and Qatar, but yeah, they have to. I mean, in the 1970s, Iran took a bunch of islands that they owned, and they made it very clear that they have to try and keep on good terms with everybody. But yeah, I think the UAE is. It's easy to just sort of like talk about the UAE as an afterthought, and I feel like we've done a decent job of giving them their due today.
So we would still not recommend you go there.
I mean, some people love it.
Oh, I know, but they tend to be a certain type of person.
They do tend to be a certain type of person.
I'm not a big fan of slave states.
Not a big fan myself.
So yes, we will be going somewhere next time, which you will find out next time.
Indeed.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire: What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.